data always requires a lot of understanding where it came from and what the decisions were that led to this number. Because otherwise you could have this Babylonian miscommunication where everybody thinks they're talking about the same thing because they're talking about the same number, but they have very different assumptions where that number came from. And that leads to a lot of confusion. If you just pour more and more and more data into an organization and hope that this will sort of enlighten everybody, you're bound to be disappointed.
I say this to people all the time. If you're trying to persuade, yes, of course you need data, but data is not what persuades human beings at the end of the day. More data is not going to convince me.
We are dealing with ever more speed and complexity of what's happening in the world outside us. And I think that complexity is beyond what a human can understand and handle, and especially understand and handle at speed, and what an organization that would just be made up of humans can handle. So data and all the tools that come with it are the key to be successful, but also I think they're becoming more and more of a survival imperative. So unless you manage to use data effectively in your decision making, you just don't stand a chance to deal with everything that's happening outside.
I want to ask the cynic's question. Why should I bother if those are all so complicated? What does data really give me that's useful?
At a macro level, it's so important to embrace data. Now, on an individual level, if you're a leader without data and just making gut decisions or uninformed decisions, I think the chances are just...
There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing it all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. All right, I want to start with, in this AI-led world, a phrase that you hear all the time, data is essential in order to make all of our artificial intelligence or machine learning effective. So you would think that data is king, but I want to ask a provocative question today. Is it? I want to talk about the pitfalls of data, what we need to watch out for as we move to a much more data-centric AI world. What could we get wrong? And how are we going to use data to drive our decisions in a more productive, efficient, effective way? And more importantly, what is it that leaders can do, even if you're not the data owner, to make sure that you create a culture where people are data inspired? So my guest today is Sebastian Wernicke. Sebastian is a partner at Exera Consulting, one of Europe's oldest economic and financial consultancies, where he leads the data science and AI practice. He's a leading expert in data and AI strategy, a former chief data scientist, and for 2 decades, he's guided organizations around the world to achieve breakthroughs in the power of data. And you're going to see his ability to understand the complexity of this topic, I think, is truly unique and informative, to say the least. Sebastian, welcome to the conversation.
What an introduction. Thank you so much for having me.
I don't think I did a good job, because I think your depth of understanding on this one is something that everybody needs. And in fact, I will say, I was just talking with somebody yesterday who's working out the AI strategy for her function in her organization. And I said, start with Sebastian's book, because I just think there's some really useful insights. But let's start at the beginning. You say that the data revolution has only just begun. We've been dealing with data and chief data scientists for a decade or so. Why do you say it's only just begun?
Yeah, it feels a bit counterintuitive, right? Because I guess most people hearing that will basically be thinking, oh God, I'm already drowning in data and drowning in dashboards. Why has it only just begun? What's about to happen? And I think you're right that data has been around for quite a while, but the way that I like to think about it is that the data revolution is sort of happening in 3 stages. And these stages are determined by how hard it is to collect data, to analyze it, and then to make decisions with it. And I think the parts that have already happened is that data collection has just become so easy. I mean, if you think about even 20 years ago or 30 years ago, if you wanted to know the location of your customers, what they were doing, you would have to have people following them around with a clipboard, essentially, and just recording that. And today we have all these devices where we can record the information. And with machines, it's the same thing, right? We can just stick sensors on them. We don't need people running around measuring it. It's all digital. It flows in. So that part has become easy. And the reason why you had to deal with so many chief data scientists for the past years, I think, is that the second part, the analysis of data, has also become much easier, because now we have a lot of tooling around, from building dashboards to analyzing very complex data like images, video, text. All of that can be done. And now we're entering the third stage, where previously, even if you had the data and you analyzed it, it was still humans that had to make most of the decisions with the data. And now with AI in the digital space and also increasingly in the physical space, so think self-driving cars, think robotics, what we're going to see is data directly driving ever more decisions. So not just the programmed actions that robots could be doing for a long, long time, but actually ingesting data, seeing what it means, and then make decisions. And I think in 10 years from now, where we see all of that automation around us and all of that data-fueled decision-making, we'll turn back and say, okay, 10 years ago, we had no idea what was coming at us. Yeah.
Yeah. So we see, if you think about the self-driving cars and the decisions that a car has to make in order to drive through a road and traffic and people and get to a destination safely, you can see the power of what decision-making could actually drive for cars. But let's take this. In the book, you do a lovely example in the healthcare space of deciding how to serve patients. Walk us through those kind of decisions and how those could happen in a data-driven world.
Yeah, so this is the space of decision rules, where we have certain types of decisions that we have to make a lot. So in the medical system, the example here is a patient comes into the ER, you don't, or the ICU unit, and you don't really have a lot of time to decide, right? They could be in a critical condition. There's only so many questions you can ask. Highly stressful, as seen on TV recently, if you watch those shows. And the point of that is that you could then say, well, we have a lot of similar situations coming in. We want to make sure that we're making the right decisions, and we are in a very stressful, high-stakes environment. So why don't we then use data to see if we can make that decision-making both easier on the decision makers and also improve the outcome? And so what has been around for quite a while in emergency medicine is that you have these decision rules or triage rules, where once a patient comes in, you have a very structured process of what you're going to ask that patient, like simple things. Age, are they on cardiovascular medication? Where do they have pain? And you're trying with as few questions as possible to make an accurate assessment of, is this a critical situation? Is this something that can, take a bit more time, or is this harmless? And so what decision rules do here is they say, well, before you have to make that decision 1,000 times to sort of learn what question should I ask and is this good, is this not good, we are just going to analyze the data, and from that we are going to derive the rules. We are going to give you the questions you should ask, and we are going to strongly suggest what the answers to those questions mean. So it's not entirely prescriptive. It's still placed as a decision recommendation system. But of course, usually you would follow that unless there's exceptional circumstances. And what that does is it frees the decision makers to focus on those cases that do not fit the rules. So anything that can be standardized, they get taken off their mind, and they can use all of their skill to deal with cases that are not captured by the rules. And this overall leads to better outcomes for the patients, but also for the doctors serving them.
Okay, I can imagine people are thinking, oh no, a robot meets me at the door and decides if I'm serious or not serious based on question. It just feels very alien. But when you're thinking about thousands upon thousands upon thousands of cases, and the ability to say, what's the likelihood, the probability that this is critical or not critical, or needs immediate action or whatever, needs this action versus that action, you actually can get a smarter decision. Now, but you still need a human at the end of it. I think that's one of your arguments. It can't just be turned over to a machine.
Yeah, I think there's also another aspect of it. And I think the reason why we are so worried about that robot meeting us is that we are thinking almost, what if I'm the exception, right? What if I come in and the rules don't apply to me and something goes wrong? And I think this is something that is quite tricky with these decision rules, that when we do them properly, on aggregate, they will lead to better outcomes, but that doesn't mean that they prevent mistakes. And so you can have these situations where they cause the occasional mistake, and that can be gruesome mistakes, right? You might classify a patient in the wrong way, and that can lead to death in the worst case.
Worst case.
But still, overall, you can probably still say these rules make sense. They improve the system. And I think that's something that is quite uncomfortable to deal with, to say, well, overall, this may be better, but what about me? That's a very natural and human reaction. I can completely understand that.
Well, and at that moment in an emergency room, I want to feel like somebody is metaphorically embracing me, taking care of me, looking out for me, understanding me, and that doesn't necessarily come with a robotic face attached to it. But I would also say, I interviewed on my podcast recently a physician who said that she realized in practicing medicine today, even as an incredibly well-trained, very competent, very conscientious physician, at the pace at which you're seeing people and evaluating, she said, it's a matter of when I misdiagnose a kid with a cold and miss that it was leukemia, because it will happen. And if you just think about the number of decisions that we're asking medical professionals to make, they make mistakes too. And so this is, if carefully planned, a way of minimizing some of those mistakes. We hope, Sebastian, at least. Okay. Yeah. But now, what's wrong with this? So you make the case that companies in particular are designed to stay constant, not to change. So what does this all mean we get wrong about data and about decision-making rules?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that we're all wired to, want to be confirmed in our beliefs, and we don't really like change all the time. I think that's very much human nature. Now, with data, I think the intuition is an interesting one, because our intuition would be that once we give people the data, that it would be easier for them to change their minds if data shows them that they're wrong, or if data indicates that maybe at least they're not entirely right. And what turns out is that naturally, we handle data exactly the same way that we handle other conflicting information. If we're confronted with data that doesn't agree with us, we will discount it. It will not be the case that we look at this, at least if we're in our natural state, and say, okay, I've been believing that for a couple of years. Now data shows me I'm completely wrong. I'm going to change my mind right away.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that if you just pour more and more and more data into an organization and hope that this will sort of enlighten everybody, you're bound to be disappointed, because what's going to happen is not that this data is going to drive new insights and change and innovation. If anything, it's going to lead to a bit more measurement and a bit more clarity, but that clarity and measurement will also be very much tuned to the organization as it is today. So if you have this large and complex system of KPIs measuring everything, that is a system geared towards optimization of what you're currently doing. That is definitely not a system that is open to, okay, the world is changing, we need to change tomorrow, let's go for it. And that may sound a bit disappointing at first, but I think the good news is that this is only the default state of the human mind and the default state of a culture. So if you manage to prepare the organization, if you manage to prepare your leaders, and if you manage to prepare your staff for these effects and how to deal effectively with data, then there's a way forward. But you have to do it. It doesn't happen on its own or just because you bought the latest dashboard.
I love this. You said two things in that I find really, really fascinating. I want to unpack each one of them. First off is the notion that data, numbers, facts, analysis are just not convincing. If I hold a belief that this is the right way to go to market, or this is what my customers want, or this is the right process to keep things from falling apart, more data is not going to convince me. And partly because I'm emotionally attached to the way it currently is and the practice and why it works and so on. And also partly because I've seen data come along before and data was just flat out wrong. So why would I trust it this time? We know that that can happen. So, and I say this to people all the time, if you're trying to persuade, yes, of course you need data, but data is not what persuades human beings at the end of the day. You want to react to what I just said before I go to the second point?
I was just thinking, and then add to that situation the slightly geeky analyst, coming into that mix, right? And also, I think analytical people who are usually doing the analysis, they will be very careful in the way that they present things and say, here's a nuance that you need to know about. And by the way, I want to explain to you exactly how I did this because I put a lot of thought into that. And that isn't helping either because it makes it so easy to just say, oh my God, I'm not even listening to this. This is, I don't believe it. This is so complex. And that person seems a little weird. And that is just not a situation for mind changing.
Right. And I can't follow what they're saying. They've given me more details and it doesn't resonate with what I already know. So why would I trust that? And there's a whole host of things that keep people from changing their minds, which is where we're headed. So I think that's interesting. How do we make data more convincing? I'll come back to that one. The second thing that you said is interesting in there is we all have KPIs in some form by different acronyms and, OKRs or whatever you want, objectives at the end of the day. But what those drive is for me as an individual working in that company to do exactly what I did before, to not adopt something new, because adopting something new is going to throw me off my objective setting for the year end. So why would I do that? And it's interesting, the thing we're using to drive performance is probably also killing any sense of innovation or change.
Yeah, very much. And I think this is also the relationship to data that you have to think about, because there are different ways to use measurements, and KPI is just one of them. So a performance indicator, I think, is the very direct way of saying, I'm going to use this number to measure and to see whether I'm doing good. And I want to see that directly. And of course, that's not the only way that you can use data. You can also use data just as a source of information, as something to be explored, something to be curious about. But of course, if you're in a performance-driven organization, and who isn't? I mean, everybody wants to perform, right? Then this can feel quite uncomfortable, I think, because a measurement, it's that number. And if that number is beyond a certain threshold, I know I'm doing good. I know the company is doing good. All is well. And that other mode of engagement, we're again in that space where it requires a lot of thoughtfulness, a lot of nuance. And I think also, that might sound a bit paradoxical, but comfort with discomfort, comfort with uncertainty, and saying, we have to look at this and we have to discuss it, but we may disagree even what the right solution is, or whether we're doing well or whether we're not. And so I think it's always very enticing to turn to data in that other way and say, okay, I just want to know, is it 5 or is it not 5? And if it's 5, we're doing well, and otherwise, no.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. What does 5 mean? We can agree that the number is 5. Is that good or is that not good? And that's a relative discussion already in and itself.
It was defined in the meeting, and then we know.
And so what we've always held as our standard. What we don't know is how does that benchmark against competitors, against opportunities, or what it could be. I mean, a whole bunch of things. But also throughout years, Sebastian, we will as companies pick a thing like stock price and say, well, that's an indication. That number is an indication of how well we're doing. And it's not a bad indication in some ways. But then we find, oh, there's flaws in that number. And so we have another number, and then we have a, EBITDA, and we keep adding on a set of numbers that tell us whether we're doing well or not. So it's interesting, the love of data, and then that number isn't good enough. I don't want to dig down in that one. I want to talk about, you have 3 myths about data that you think we have to get straight if we're going to really move into getting the best we can out of a data-inspired company. Let's talk about those 3 myths.
Yeah, and they will completely seem counterintuitive at first, so I'm going to try to explain each one of them in a bit more detail. So the first myth is simply that data is objective. And I think this is something that sounds very counterintuitive, because we think, well, like we just said, a number is a number. What's there to discuss, right? But once we start compressing all of the reality that's out there into a number, we have to make quite a number of subjective decisions along the way. So, for example, if we're trying to determine how many active customers do we have on our platform, there's a lot of decisions we have to make. Well, who do we count as a customer? When do we count them as active? Let alone revenue, right? When we then bring that into the mix. And so when we just think, well, data is objective and there's nothing to discuss here, I think we're discounting that data always requires a lot of understanding where it came from and what the decisions were that led to this number. Because otherwise you could have this sort of Babylonian miscommunication where everybody thinks they're talking about the same thing because they're talking about the same number, but they have very different assumptions where that number came from. And that leads to a lot of confusion in many organizations I've seen. Now, okay, once we accept that, you might think, and this brings us to the second myth, well, okay, let's say we all agree on where the number came from, then the data surely must speak for itself. As soon as we see the data, the conclusion must be clear. And that, unfortunately, is also not the case. So I give this example in the book about 3 different TV shows where you have different ratings for them. And you're asked to determine, based just on the data, which one is the best one. And what I can show you there is that you can make 3 perfectly logical and rational arguments for each one of them just based on data. So, for example, if you care about, I want to have ratings that are supported by a lot of viewers, then you come to a different conclusion than if you say, I'm going to just go for the best rating, or I'm going to go for the show that has the least worst ratings. All of which are completely logical, but you have to decide what is important to you and what does best actually mean? How does that word translate into analysis? And unless you do that, you're also going to end up in confusion. And now the third thing is, the third myth, well, we might say, okay, we've agreed on where the data comes from. We've agreed on how to analyze it. And now we're going to get an answer out of the data, a clear yes or a clear no. And as soon as things get complex, and most decisions, unfortunately, these days are complex, you're not going to get that out of the data. You're usually going to get a puzzle piece of statistics where it says, at best, here's a 60% chance this might work, or this has worked in about 70% of cases in the past. And as a decision maker, of course, that's highly disappointing and frustrating, because what am I going to do with a 70% decision? Yeah? Is it a yes or is it a no? Am I going to go for it or am I not going to go for it? And so the important part about these data myths is not, I think, to say, here, we made a smart argument and let us teach you about data. I think it's really about expectation management. Because if you approach data thinking that you're going to get an objective truth, the data will speak for itself, and out pops the yes or no answer, you're bound to be disappointed by data. And that ultimately leads then to a lot of data frustration, where I think people then say, if data is this complicated and it doesn't give me the yes or no answer, I'm going to go with my gut feeling anyways. And that, of course, is not the right way to do it. But you have to acknowledge that you're going to have to deal with a lot more complexity and nuance than you might initially hope for in order to then make a more informed decision and a better decision but unfortunately not an easier decision with data.
That's the important part. It's more informed, but it's not necessarily easier. Okay, so we assume the data is objective, but that entirely depends upon how we define the numbers that we want, the measures that we want to use to draw the data in. You gave the example about the number of customers, and some people, if they haven't looked at that problem, might not understand that one. I'm going to give you a recent one. I was arguing with a taxi driver about the largest airport in the world. Google, largest airport. Mm-hmm. That entirely depends. Number of passengers, number of flights, number of active hours, size of plane, number of seats. I get an answer depending upon. There's a classic example of what does it mean to be the largest, let alone some of these more complex things.
Oh, 100%. I've been to, I think I've been to the largest waterfall in the world about 5 times now, and on a different locations.
And 5 different places. Exactly right. Exactly right. Okay. And that it will speak for itself. So it will be immediately transparent that that means we should do A or B, and that it gives us an answer. That none of those are true. All right, Sebastian, I want to ask the cynic's question. Why should I bother if those are all so complicated? What does data really give me that's useful?
Yeah, so at a high level, we are dealing with ever more speed and complexity of what's happening in the world outside us. And I think there are countless examples of supply chains breaking, being disrupted. I think we have these long-term issues of how we're going to feed the world, how, we have climate change to deal with, we have aging populations. So all of these macro problems that create complexity for a business, and I think also create the need for constant vigilance and also an ability to adapt very quickly. And that complexity is beyond what a human can understand and handle, and especially understand and handle at speed, and what an organization that would just be made up of humans can handle. So data and all the tools that come with it, from the insights on the dashboard to the increased automated decision-making and the automated analysis, are the key to even be able, to be successful, but also I think they're becoming more and more of a survival imperative. So unless you manage to use data effectively in your decision-making, by which I mean not just in your decision-making as in you make this decision, but also how you set up the entire decision-making in the organization, and that will include automation and automated analysis, I think you just don't stand a chance to deal with everything that's happening outside. And that is why I think at a macro level, it's so important to embrace data and to say, okay, there is going to be this hose of data pouring in, and it's going to be more and more and more, but we have to deal with that, and we have to integrate it in our actions. Now, on an individual level, if you're a leader, I think it's the same advantage that you get, because without data and just making gut decisions or uninformed decisions, I think the chances are just too high to be wrong. I mean, of course, our intuition always tells us that we're right and we have a good gut feeling, but any research you look at shows that this is not the case, and that making more informed decisions and adding more useful information into your decision-making process is going to give you an advantage in the long run. Yeah. And so it's the only way. Data is the way.
Data is the way. All right. And that means we've got to be really good to data, or otherwise we're making bad decisions, getting bad insights. I know I have seen in a number of cases where things like healthcare, that you can make better decisions about what is the right standard of care by looking at a massive amount of data and starting to spot trends that I would not see as a human, and recognize that, wait a minute, we need to do something about this trend, and that's going to be more productive for care in the long run, as opposed to wait until somebody is ill and then try to treat the disease. So I've seen all sorts of things. I'm a believer. I just had to ask the cynic question there just for the record. What I think is interesting about what you're arguing, Sebastian, that I hadn't really put together in this way, if people are sort of saying, how am I going to use all the automated tools that are available at the moment? It's really thinking about the decisions that we make over and over and over again that are somewhat routine. and that we could now automate so that I can free my brain to think about the more complex decisions. And I think if people think about in their daily lives, what is the thing that I have to think about and do over and over and over again, and how do I automate that? It seems like that's a place that we could begin to go, particularly around decision making. So inspiring for me. Okay, let's turn to leaders then. Because you make a big deal that at the end of the day, it's not about the data, and it's not about the data and analytics, and it's not about the technology. It's really about the culture. Give us your pitch for why data inspired is so important.
Yeah, so I think this requires two parts to explain. One is maybe what does a good data culture even look like as opposed to a bad one? And then how do you get there, and how do leaders get there? So a good data culture is one that is fundamentally based on curiosity. So let's say you look at the performance indicators, right, of the past quarter, and something goes wrong. What is the immediate reaction? So there's one way to react, which is whose fault is that, and who's responsible to fix it right now? That is a very harshly data-driven mindset to say, here's the number, you fix it. The data-inspired mindset, which also for me represents a very good and healthy data culture, is to be curious about that and say, okay, interesting. Now we want to understand why that happened. And we don't want to understand that so that we can put blame on somebody, but we want to understand that because we want to attack the problem. So it's also a joint problem-solving exercise rather than a, let's find the culprit kind of exercise. That's one part of a healthy data culture. Another part of a healthy data culture is mind changing in the face of data. And so, as I mentioned, that is something that doesn't come naturally to people, and it especially doesn't come naturally to leaders, because we look to leaders to have a clear opinion, to show us the way. And a leader that is constantly saying, I proclaimed this for a couple of months, but now I saw the data and it's going to be something different. That is something quite unusual. I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's unhealthy, but it's definitely something that you have to get used to. And that is also a sign of a great data culture to, if you want to have a very vivid image, the junior person, third week, they go to the senior leader and say, what you said just there, I think I have data that contradicts that. And the leader is saying, okay, let me take a look and maybe you're right. I think that is the healthiest data culture, that mind changing. Now, how do you get there? It's not happening by nature. I think there's a couple of elements that you need to have in place. So the first one, and that might not come as a surprise after what I just said, is a psychological safety. So you need a safe space to say, let's investigate the problem. Let's not blame. You need a safe space to say, let's change our minds. Let's publicly declare that we changed our minds. And you need to create that space. And of course, creating that space, that is something that only a leader and senior leaders can do. Because unless they live that by example, people are just going to watch and say, okay, they declare data culture on the poster in the hallway, but they're not really living it. That's not going to get me the promotion or the bonus that I'm hoping for, right? So it needs to be lived by example. And I think that is sort of the second aspect of that. How do you create it? Well, you have to demonstrate it. You have to show it. And people need to feel that dealing with data in this way is what is, expected here in this place. This is the way that we do things. And then there's a third aspect, but I don't want to overemphasize it, which is sort of oftentimes called data literacy. I mean, of course, in order to be able to do that, to have that nuanced discussion and to be able to dive deep into the data, you do need a certain amount of training to understand that weird language that is data. And that doesn't come naturally to everybody. So you need to learn how to think in probabilities, for example, that 70% probability that I just mentioned. What does that mean exactly? How do I deal with that? And that can be accomplished with training. The reason I don't like to overemphasize that is that sometimes it's done the other way around, where people say, oh, we'll just give everybody a data training and then we're going to have a great data culture. And they don't pay attention to the leadership aspects, which are so crucial in order to make that happen. So leadership first, and yes, do a few trainings, but don't do it the other way around.
It also means if I'm going to use data, particularly use data to make decisions in a smart way, I've got to have a pretty sophisticated understanding of the problem space, because choosing what numbers, what metrics, how things go together, and understanding where the errors might lie in the data that I'm pulling in as well, it takes some sophistication. So how do you encourage people to understand that complexity before they start?
Mm-hmm. Well, in a in a very blunt way, actually, with a huge checklist. So it's one of the appendices in the book, actually. So where that checklist came from is, I mean, I have been doing this for many years now, and I have run into this trap so often that I thought I understood the problem, and you're in action mode, and it's like, okay, got it, let's go, let's analyze everything, and I already know what you're asking, I know what your problem is. And of course, that went wrong so many times. So over times, I just built this checklist and said, okay, before you dive in, here's the things that you really need to understand about the problem you are trying to solve. So the problem space, of course, as you also know, it's so multifaceted, right? You need to understand the stakeholders. You need to understand what stakeholder am I solving this for, and who are the other stakeholders who might be unhappy with a certain kind of solution. I need to, when it comes to data, of course, also understand technological constraints. I need to understand legal constraints oftentimes, with data protection and privacy. Am I allowed to do that? So when it comes to a complex data issue, let's say, I'm trying to design a new tool to diagnose a disease or help patients in long-term care, there are hundreds, I think, of questions you need to ask yourself in order to make sure I've really understood what the issues are, what my solution space potentially looks like. And then I can also go to understanding, okay, where do I now get the data, and how can data help me? But it's very important to focus on that classic part of deep problem understanding even before you dive into the data. So what I like to say is always purpose first, data second. And you need to keep that order rather than saying, okay, where's the data and where do I find the answer right now?
Yeah, right. Let's go hope we can find something out of it in the data. Here's the data set.
We collected something a couple of years ago. That must be useful. That's also useful. Yeah, because it feels so efficient. But of course, usually it's not.
One of the arguments that you make so powerfully in the book, that's at the very beginning, is this notion that I have to be super clear on what metrics I'm pulling into the data and what purpose I'm using it for. We've already talked about that. The data is not objective. That's one of the myths. And you do this. I want to get you to tell one story, which is the HR recruiting story. I believe it's from Amazon, about setting up what most companies are doing, a screening of resumes.
Yeah.
So tell us about what happens there, because I think it illustrates everything you've been saying.
Oh, it's a wonderful story. And I should say up front, before we all say after the story, haha, Amazon, what did they do? This is something that happened to a very sophisticated company that was very careful about it, right? So even then, that I think is the moral of the story.
Yeah.
So here's what Amazon was trying to do. This is around 2014, I think. So they were early to this. And they said, well, we want to have a more objective hiring process. So what we would like to do is we would like to have a data-driven step in there where we take the resumes that are coming in and we run an algorithm across those. And that algorithm is going to tell us, is that person suitable for the job or is it not? And then we're going to have this pre-sorting step. And the hope, of course, was that this would be a very objective, unbiased way of doing things. And because they were sophisticated and careful, they also said, well, there's always a danger that an algorithm might do something like discriminate for the wrong reasons. So from the resumes that are coming in, we're going to scrub things like the name of that person or certain location data. So anything, that might hint at a gender or a certain socioeconomic or ethnic background, we're going to try and get rid of that. And so they did that. And they then trained the algorithm on resumes that they had. Now, there's one additional crucial component in here, which is, of course, how do you tell an algorithm whether a person is suitable or not, right? You have this training step, this initial one where you need to say, oh, these are good examples, these are bad examples. And so what they thought was, and I think it's also quite logical to think this way, is that they said, well, we have a lot of people that are already working at our company. So let's take the ones that have had a long and successful career. We're going to take those as examples of successful hiring and tell the algorithm, basically, this is the attributes that you should be looking for. Okay, so we have all the things in place. We have the data, we've scrubbed it, and we've given the algorithm a goal. So this is, today you would call it AI. At the time they called it machine learning. So the machine learning runs and it trains, and it then starts running. And what it turns out is that this algorithm very, very quickly becomes discriminating against women. And so they turn it off again. And the interesting question now is, of course, why did it do that? I mean, you try to use the objective criteria of saying, here's people that had a long and successful career, and we scrubbed all the names from the resumes. What is happening? Why is this thing turning against women? And so they investigated that, and they found a couple of reasons coming together to create that effect. Now, the first one is that an algorithm is extremely objective, which sounds good, but that also means that it has no idea and no notion about things that it shouldn't be doing. So an algorithm doesn't know that it's bad to not select women systematically, unless you tell it very explicitly to do so. So this objectivity, which oftentimes I think we portray as, oh, it's unbiased. It also means it doesn't have any morals and any ethnic compass, unless we explicitly build that into it. Yeah, it doesn't have that. And so that's the first thing. The objectivity can become a problem. Now, the second thing is that when you use a criterion of saying, well, we are going to take all of the employees that had a long and successful career. Well, if you look at history, most companies in leadership positions, they used to have and still have more men than women. So what the algorithm does is that it says, wait, here's an easy indicator that will tell me whether somebody will have a long and successful career. I just look at their gender. Wow, case solved. And since, it doesn't have any moral compass, well, case closed. Now, the object, of course, the people that designed the algorithm, they were aware of that, which is why they scrubbed the names from the CVs. But, well, algorithms are very, very smart, and they will do anything to achieve their objective. And so there's lots of indications in a resume that are very difficult to scrub. Let's say somebody won a prestigious scholarship for women. Somebody was captain of the women's volleyball team. Somebody went to a college that, or studied a certain subject that primarily accepts male students or has male students. Who knows, right? So there's lots of indicators that the machine learning algorithm can use to piece together the gender of the person and the gender, behind the resume. And so all of these things then come together. The algorithm says, oh, my goal is to find somebody who has a long and successful career. Look at these people. They were all male. And by the way, I figured out this really, really clever way to determine who's male and who's not. So let's bring this together. I have a good solution for you. And that's what happened. And I just want to repeat, this is what happened to a company that, in my mind, was very careful about this. And that also, Amazon is an extremely data-driven company. They have super smart people, right? And even then, if you're not entirely careful, it can still happen. And I think that is, beside the general moral of the story, which is sort of algorithms, their objectivity can behave like this genie, that really gives you your wish, but you haven't read the fine print of all the things that go wrong while you're getting your wish, also can just happen to very smart people in any setting. So you really need to be mindful and careful about designing these things.
I think that comes right back to your first point, that it all depends upon how you define what you're taking as the data, where the data is coming from, what indicators I'm using for this algorithm to make a decision, that part is not as objective as we might like to believe it is. All right. So I'm taking away from this conversation, I love that story. I just think that's a fabulous reminder that, one, we have to be really clear about what our purpose is first, because if we're not clear about our purpose, then we're going to make all the mistakes we don't want to make. That number two, your three myths are really, really important. Data is not purely objective because it depends upon how we define it, where we pull it from, what we're looking at, what we mean by our words, by our metrics. 2, it doesn't necessarily speak for itself. People don't change their mind immediately just by looking at data. And 3, it doesn't really tell you a yes, no. It gives you a probability answer, but not more than that. So you got to learn to think through in those ways. And most importantly, I think your core point is if we don't have a culture that looks at data in the right way, data inspired, to use your language, then we're going to be victims of some pretty poor mistakes along the way. So curiosity, psychological safety, willingness to change our mind, data literacy, all are really important components of the culture. Sebastian, I love the argument. What a great story.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
It's a really important topic. Sebastian, if somebody wants to find you, where's the best place to reach out to you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. Please reach out. Of course, feel free to follow, but also feel free to connect. I'm always keen to learn about new, interesting people. Other than that, of course, the book is available wherever books are sold, or you can go to datainspired.org to find out more about me and the book.
And I should also say there's some fabulous TED Talks you might want to look up, and the book is called Data Inspired. So Sebastian, thanks for joining us today. What a great conversation. I loved it.
Thank you so much.
And join us next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone. And if you want to watch this, go to our YouTube channel, Out of the Comfort Pod, and you'll find this live appearance in person with all of our gestures and everything to go with it. See you next week.